Hello? Hey everyone, I'm just checking to see if my microphone is working. I don't believe it is. Nope. Can anybody hear me now? Okay, good to go? Sweet. Wanted to check and make sure. Alrighty. Well, welcome everybody to my little home here on YouTube. All 37 subscribers of me. I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to come in here and listen to what I've got to say. I wanted to thank you in advance to both Six Cats Press, Joe at Six Cats Press, and Esther, Marie, and Duhar, who are moderating this stream today. I also wanted to thank the moderators of the AWC, Devin, SD Houston, and Margaret Pinard, who have done a lovely, wonderful job of setting everything up here. So, yeah, without further ado, I want to thank you for attending the 2024 AuthorTube Writing Conference and welcome you to Understanding Poetry on Craft, Discipline, and Discovering the Poet Within. My name is Ariadne Alexis McQuarrie, and I use she, they pronouns. Now, a little bit about me. I am a published poet who received my Bachelor of Arts in Creative Writing from Roanoke College, and I'm currently a fully funded Master of Fine Arts student in poetry at the University of Kentucky, where I also teach English and creative writing. I am the editor-in-chief of On Gaia Literary Magazine and the former poetry editor for the Roanoke Review. I've always loved poetry, and now that it's essentially my career, I hope I can impart my love of poetry onto you all today, if you don't already share that love with me. Now, before we start, I want you to free your mind of two things. One, free your mind of any misconceptions you may have had on poetry. Forget what you were taught, forget what you assumed, forget what you've been led to believe, all of it. Poetry is, plain and simple, a written work in which deliberate intensity is placed on expressing certain feelings and ideas with a distinctive style or rhythm, and that's it. That means song lyrics can be poems. That means a paragraph of text can be a poem, depending on how the prose is crafted. That means a shopping receipt, or a single sentence, or an image crafted out of words can be a poem. And that's where we'll begin. Remember, I said I wanted you to free your mind of two things. The next one I wanted you to free your mind on is free your mind of any reservations or hangups you have about becoming a poet. You already are one. We're all writers here, right? Then you're a poet, whether you know it yet or not. We're all poets. We have eyes that observe and minds that process. We have emotions that flow and stagnate in rhythms. Each one of you watching has a conscious and has a body the conscious resides in. If you can put those watchful eyes and those racing minds and those undulating emotions and those bodies of yours to writing, then that is enough to be a poet. Earlier this morning, D.L. Tillery, who I see is in the comments, hello, D.L. Tillery, love you, gave an amazing presentation on discovering the self in poetry. And if you haven't watched that yet and you're confused by what I just told you, she does dive a little more into that, and I highly recommend giving her video a watch. Now, if a poem can be anything put to a certain style or rhythm, and a poet can be anyone who pays attention to style and rhythm, we're starting off with a pretty broad terminology and a pretty vague grasp on a set of rules that really don't quite frankly exist at the moment. Classical poetry, as anyone who has studied literature at length will remember quite strongly, does have distinct terminology and strict rules. You have sonnets, you have haikus, you have villanelles, and so on. All of these are poetic structures that do have their own defined sets of rules. But poetry in the modern day has grown to transcend from its own boundaries. And that's what I find so beautiful about it. Now that we've defined poetry, and now that we've established who can consider themselves a poet, I figured it best to show you a favorite poem of mine to give y'all a better understanding of how this all works. Now, the easiest way to break down what a poem is and what it's trying to tell you is by performing a close read. Essentially, you'll read the poem and jot down anything that catches your eye, any language that seems intentional, any series of events that seem connected, any glimpses of symbolism that shine at you. Once you've studied the poem, its message will become clear to you. The poem I chose for today is Ross Gay's Ode to Drinking Water from My Hands, which comes from his book Catalog of Unabashed Gratitude. I'll read it now for all of us. Ode to Drinking Water from My Hands, which today in the garden I'd forgotten I'd known, and more, forgotten I'd learned, and was taught this by my grandfather, who, in the midst of arranging and watering the small bouquets on mostly the freshest graves, saw my thirst and cranked the rusty red pump, bringing forth from what sounded like the gravelly throat of an animal a frigid torrent, and with his hands made a lagoon from which he drank, and then I drank, before he cranked again, making of my hands now a fountain in which I can see the silty bottom drifting while I drink and drink. And my grandfather waters the flowers on the graves, among which are his and his wife's, unfinished and patient, glistening after he rinses the bird shit from his wife's, and the pump exhales, and I drink to the bottom of my fountain and join him in his work. Now that we've all read this piece, I'd like to show you a bit of what I tend to look for in a close read and what conclusions I came to after closely reading this piece. The main thing to jump out at me in this poem was a clearly defined timeline. This is important because with the timeline Ross Gay uses in his poem, I can infer that the poem discusses the process of moving through life towards death and how death is a natural part of life. This timeline I'm referencing occurs as the grandfather and the poem's narrator are both drinking water from their hands. He drank, and then I drank, before he cranked the pump again. There is a brief interruption to the timeline, but it picks up again as the narrator continues drinking from their hands while their grandfather waters his and his wife's graves. It's only implied until the end of the poem, but once we reach the end of this timeline, we discover that this water is meant to represent life, and the drinking of the water is the passing of time. I drink to the bottom of my fountain represents the narrator's own arrival at death's door, where at the end of the poem, the narrator joins his grandparents in death. The naturality of this death is highlighted through specific words the poet chooses to illustrate the scene he's writing about. Things such as the gravelly throat of the water pump and the lagoon the water makes in the narrator's hands and the bird shit painting the headstones suggest a wildness and a rugged tranquility to this portrait of the inevitability of death. Now, this is just one example of a close read that could be performed on this poem. Any amount of readers can come to a variety of different conclusions than I did based on what they bring to the table when they sit down to read a poem. And that's what I love so much about poetry. It's fluid, and it never will mean the same thing to more than one person. You have the freedom to pick apart the language of the piece you're reading and craft your own story from it. Now, moving on, I wanted to take a little time before I open to our Q&A session to talk about submitting your own poetry to a literary magazine. Let's say you were inspired by my talk somehow to go read more poetry, and after a while of reading, you became so inspired that you wrote a poem or two of your own. The first step is to research magazines to see which ones are the right fit for your poem. Let's say you wrote about nature. A magazine specializing in feminist poetry might not be the best fit for your nature poem, but a nature journal would. There's really two major ways I suggest people start their research. One is submittable. Last year, Laura Nettles did a fantastic presentation that involved a walkthrough of how to use Submittable and how to submit work through Submittable, which I see that Joe linked down in the comments. Thank you, Joe. So I highly suggest you watch her video from last year if you're not already familiar with the mechanics of the website. Literary magazines will list open calls for submissions on Submittable and oftentimes discuss what kinds of work they want to see directly on their Submittable page. Another good place to do research is, believe it or not, Twitter. Twitter has a wealth of indie grassroots literary magazines just like mine that publish all sorts of creative work in all sorts of genres. Oftentimes, you'll find literary magazines that are active on Twitter, but nowhere to be seen on Submittable, as they process their submissions through email instead. So it's a good habit to check both for open calls to submit. Once you've found a magazine that feels like a good fit for your poem, you're going to want to check that magazine's submission guidelines. Oftentimes, these will be listed in the open call for submissions itself, but if it isn't, make sure to check their website. Every magazine has their own set of rules for what to submit, what not to submit, how they want your work formatted, and what they want in your cover letter. It is always, always, always best practice to read these rules and follow them diligently. I mentioned cover letters just a second ago, and I promise you're not nearly as intensive as anything you're going to find on a job application. A cover letter in poetry is essentially the following: who you are, the title or titles of your work, any content warnings you want editors to be aware of, a friendly note about your affinity for the magazine you're submitting to, and a short third person biographical statement reiterating who you are, what you do, and where people can find you. For example, here's the cover letter I used in a recent submission. Dear editors, attached is my poem title. I hope my work can find a home here in name of literary magazine. My poetry has previously appeared in these places. Thank you for your consideration. Yours, Ariadne McQuarrie. And this was my third person bio. Ariadne Alexis McQuarrie, she, they, is an MFA student at the University of Kentucky. She received her BA in creative writing from Roanoke College. She is the editor in chief of On Gaia Literary Magazine. Her poetry and fiction can be found in Black Fox Literary Magazine, The Bitch and Kitsch, The Engine Idling, and elsewhere. She is on Instagram at Flame Azaleas. Now, after you've written your cover letter and gotten your work formatted per the magazine's guidelines, all that's left to do is submit. Now, writing a poem takes a surprising amount of focus, which is why I strongly recommend having some sort of routine in place for when you write, if you want to write poetry regularly. Best practice for me has always been to write daily, even if it's only a sentence or two. Keep a journal or the notes app on your phone close at hand and jot down any fragment of an image or sentence that comes to mind. Block out a portion of time daily to sit and bring yourself to write something. It doesn't have to be good, that's for later drafts. Just put words to paper and the rest will come to you with time. One thing I've always found to help inspire me is to go outside and write whatever it is I see. I document everything from the clouds to the trees to the ground. And I've found that more often than not, my reflections on nature tend to mold themselves into poems. Another tip is to read poetry, and lots of it. Find poets you like and devour their work. Get into the habit of reading poetry often. I myself try to read at least one poem a day. Introducing the medium into your regular reading habits will better familiarize you with the realm of poetry and will help you glean inspiration from the world and the words around you. I've left a reading list of some wonderful works to encourage and motivate you in the description below. Now I'll leave you with one final warning before we open to Q&A. The literary world is fraught with rejection. I myself have been published, but my ratio of acceptances to rejections is one acceptance in every 50 to 70 submissions. It takes magazines months to reach back out. If you're going to submit, do so with an open mind and an open heart. Do not give up on a piece that has been rejected. Re-examine it, edit it if you feel like you need to, and submit again. Speaking from the perspective of an editor, a good 80% of rejections are pieces that are fantastic, but just aren't the right fit to be homed in that particular issue of that particular magazine. Keep trying until your poem has a home. Your 20th submission could be your first acceptance. Now I'm going to open up to a little bit of a Q&A. I've seen a couple of questions in the comments. And feel free to leave any questions you may have below as we get into this. I believe the first question is from Joe, Six Cats Press. He says, how do I know if my poem is even any good or has meaning? And really, that is completely subjective. That is completely up to you. That is completely up to your readers. Everyone is going to have a different perspective on what you write. Something that you might find is great, someone else might find is terrible, or someone finds your work great and you find it terrible. It really all depends. And I really don't like looking at poetry through the realm of good or bad. Just, has it helped you? Has it helped somebody else? Where was it coming from? Have you depicted where it was coming from in the most accurate way possible? Is that's really how I get into it. Next question is from Esther. How does revision look like for poetry? That is honestly a really tough one because it really all depends on who you are and who you're working with. My experience in terms of editing poetry has largely been within academia. And so I am sitting in a workshop of maybe 10 to 15 people that are all writing poetry and all wanting feedback. And so we really bounce and collaborate off of one another. Now, really, the big thing when I come to submitting my own poetry is usually the first draft is just to get whatever I have in my mind out onto a page. All of my first drafts are in a notebook. Every single last one, I handwrite them. Every consecutive draft after that, I have a handwritten version. I find for me specifically that handwriting my drafts helps me better understand the language that I'm using and helps me better understand how I'm working on it. Um, from there, it's pretty similar to drafting a short fiction piece. Just go through several drafts of tightening the language and tightening the timeline and tightening everything else and just getting to a point where you feel like it's finished. And sometimes it never does feel like it's finished, but sometimes you have to submit anyway, even if it doesn't feel finished. And I always, always, always have that handwritten copy. When I get into later drafts, I like to read it out loud. I like to speak it to an audience to get their feedback. And that's really what helps me. Next question. What are your thoughts on free verse poetry? Um, so, free verse poetry is a lot of what I write, actually. Um, So I find that free verse poetry is really exciting because it really has been what has, in terms of more modern poetry, expanded the boundaries of what poetry can be defined as. And so I really appreciate, thank you for the 3 minute warning. I really appreciate it in the sense that you're not struggling to cut yourself down to follow a set of logistics. And so you see a lot of free verse poetry getting published nowadays, and I'm really happy for that. A lot of this book, actually, Catalog of Unabashed Gratitude, is free verse poetry. And it's a really interesting medium because anything can be defined as a poem as long as it has that tightness of language and as long as it has some sort of rhythm now. And I think that's beautiful. Let's see. Are there any more questions? I don't believe there are. So in that case, because I did get my 3 minute warning, I'm going to go ahead and give y'all my outro. I do appreciate y'all for coming. And it looks like it's about time to wrap up anyway. So if you enjoyed my presentation, please make sure to submit your feedback. There is an AWC feedback form in the description. If you want to see more from me, make sure you subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell, as well as follow the link tree in my description. You can follow me there on Instagram and Twitter, all that jazz. I've got it all linked in that link tree, especially my literary magazine. Please look at my literary magazine. If you're interested in poetry at all, we have issue 1 is coming out this July, and I'm really excited for that. This has been a passion project of mine for years, and it's finally kicking up off the ground. Presenting after me are Sam Wicker with Tools to Get Unstuck in Your Writing, Adrian Santiago with The Emotional Roller Coaster that is publishing a novel, and DL Tillery with Mastering the Art of Short Story Writing, which is where I'll be going. Thank you again for attending, and I will see y'all on the flip side.